In the chaotic aftermath of the most infamous slap in television history, Chris Rock's phone relentlessly lit up. Former President Barack Obama called. Media mogul Oprah Winfrey called. Chris declined them all. He only answered the phone for one man, Dave Chappelle. Chris didn't freeze on that stage out of cowardice, but out of a profound generational wisdom passed down by his parents. Why was Chappelle the absolute only person he needed to speak to? Because both men knew exactly what Will Smith had just unleashed. A bloody nightmare that would become reality just weeks later. For decades, an invisible sacred fence has existed between a comedian standing on a stage and the audience sitting in the dark. It is a fundamental social contract built on absolute trust and vulnerability. The crowd is allowed to boo, they are allowed to heckle, and they are certainly allowed to walk out in disgust. However, under no circumstances is anyone ever permitted to cross that physical threshold and lay their hands on the person holding the microphone. That absolute safety is the only condition under which true, unfiltered comedy can actually survive. It allows artists to dissect the ugliest, most uncomfortable truths of our society without the paralyzing fear of violent physical retaliation. But when Will Smith walked up those stairs on a global broadcast, he did not just slap a colleague. He single-handedly demolished that sacred barrier, casually sending a dangerous message to millions of viewers that assaulting a performer was now an acceptable reaction to a joke. The bloody consequences of that broken social contract manifested faster and more violently than anyone in the industry could have possibly anticipated. Exactly 5 weeks after the Academy Awards, the nightmare became a reality at the legendary Hollywood Bowl. Dave Chappelle, one of the most revered and powerful voices in modern comedy, was entirely immersed in his set, completely unaware that the rules of his profession had been permanently rewritten. Out of the darkness, a young man vaulted over the security barriers and charged the stage with terrifying speed. He violently tackled Chappelle to the ground in front of a horrified, screaming arena. This was not a drunken heckler looking for a brief moment of viral fame. The attacker was armed with a replica handgun that concealed a razor-sharp folding knife blade, turning a night of laughter into a terrifying fight for survival. The comedy underworld was instantly shaken to its absolute core, realizing that holding a microphone now essentially meant wearing a target on your back. Will Smith had inadvertently opened a dark Pandora's box, transforming every single comedy club and arena into a potential physical war zone. But in that moment of absolute chaos and pure adrenaline, the true resilience of the comedy brotherhood was put on magnificent display. Immediately after the armed attacker was subdued and dragged away by a swarm of security guards, Chris Rock unexpectedly emerged from the backstage shadows. He calmly walked over to Dave Chappelle, took the microphone, and looked out into the stunned, breathless crowd. With the precision of a master assassin, Chris casually asked, "Was that the softest rapper ever?" That single, razor-sharp punchline did much more than just instantly diffuse the terrifying tension inside the Hollywood Bowl. It was a calculated, venomous strike aimed directly at the fragile ego and the fabricated, tough guy masculinity that Will Smith had desperately tried to project. But to truly comprehend why a simple joke about a 90s rap career carried such a devastating, lethal impact, we have to rewind the clock. We must go back to that exact night in March, to the infamous 2 seconds that inadvertently declared an all-out war. On the evening of March 27, 2022, the sharp, violent crack of an open hand echoing through the Dolby Theater brought the entire planet to a standstill. Group chats globally exploded, news anchors fumbled their live reads, and social media fractured into a million chaotic debates. But the absolute worst part for Will Smith was not the physical act itself, nor the immediate shockwave it sent through the press. The true catastrophe lay in a fundamental misunderstanding of how the comedy ecosystem actually operates. There is an unspoken, ironclad rule in the entertainment business. When you physically strike a comedian, you absolutely do not silence them. Instead, you hand them the keys to a vault of priceless, culturally devastating ammunition. By walking onto that stage and resorting to violence, Will Smith did not just assault a single presenter. He foolishly drafted a formal declaration of war against the most dangerous, sharp-tongued individuals on the planet, accidentally turning the entire comedy underworld into his sworn unified enemy. Comedians operate on a completely different frequency than traditional Hollywood actors. They do not rely on studio executives, carefully crafted public relations statements, or focus groups to shape their narrative. Their entire livelihood is built on taking pain, absurdity, and trauma and violently forging it into weaponized humor on an open microphone. Will Smith fundamentally miscalculated the retaliation, assuming his massive A-list status would permanently shield him from any real consequences from a guy who tells jokes for a living. That catastrophic misjudgment paved the way for the ultimate plot twist in this Hollywood tragedy. Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle did not retreat into the shadows, nor did they play the role of the quiet, traumatized victims. Instead, these two legendary titans of comedy quietly teamed up to execute a public, surgical dismantling of Will Smith's carefully curated legacy. They prepared to deliver the most savage, meticulously constructed takedown in the history of television, ensuring the punchlines would outlive any PR apology. But before the comedians could even begin to sharpen their knives, the industry itself committed an act that poured gasoline on the fire. What truly infuriated the comedy world wasn't just the physical assault itself, as shocking as it was. The true crime was the sickening, deeply disturbing display of Hollywood hypocrisy that took place just 40 minutes later in that exact same room. To fully grasp the psychological horror of that night, you have to closely analyze the tape of the incident. Chris Rock's joke referencing G.I. Jane was inherently mild, a standard, almost outdated Oscars jab that barely registered on the scale of offensive comedy. In fact, the cameras clearly caught Will Smith genuinely laughing at the punchline initially. But then, a terrifying shift occurred. Will did not snap in a sudden, blinding fit of impulsive rage. He stood up, adjusted his tailored suit, and walked onto the stage with a deliberate, bone-chilling calmness. That terrifyingly calm march across the stage was the antithesis of a crime of passion. It was a calculated, conscious decision to humiliate and physically harm a smaller man in front of the entire world. And yet, the immediate aftermath revealed a systemic failure that left comedians everywhere sick to their stomachs. No security guards rushed the stage to tackle the aggressor. No Academy officials stepped in to halt the broadcast. Chris Rock was left completely exposed and isolated, forced to rely on sheer, superhuman professionalism to crack a joke and save the show mere seconds after being battered. But the absolute darkest, most twisted chapter of this entire saga unfolded exactly 40 minutes after the assault. Will Smith, a man who had just committed a blatant act of battery on an international broadcast, was invited back up onto the stage. He was not escorted out in handcuffs. He was handed the Academy Award for Best Actor. Through tears, he delivered a speech about being a fierce protector and a vessel for love, demanding sympathy while the man he just assaulted was left to process his trauma backstage. The true villainy of the night, however, was not just Will Smith's actions, but the reaction of the peers surrounding him. The entire room of glamorous Hollywood elites, a group of people who constantly lecture the public on morality and nonviolence, stood up and gave the abuser a roaring, tearful standing ovation. This staggering display of cognitive dissonance exposed the absolute moral bankruptcy of the entertainment industry, proving that inside the Hollywood bubble, star power completely eclipses basic human decency. Legendary comedians watching from home were absolutely nauseated by the spectacle. Jim Carrey went on national television and ruthlessly eviscerated the industry, publicly labeling the applauding celebrities a spineless mass. The entire comedy community realized that Hollywood would always protect its most profitable assets, even if it meant sacrificing the absolute safety of a comedian. While the Hollywood elite clapped like trained seals to protect their fragile ecosystem, Dave Chappelle looked at the stage and saw something entirely different. He didn't see a fierce, honorable protector defending his family. He saw a man suffering a total, irreversible psychological collapse in real time. Instead of just condemning Will Smith like the rest of the world, Dave Chappelle approached the violent spectacle with the analytical eye of a street philosopher. He did not see an honorable husband fiercely defending his family. He saw a deeply fractured human being buckling under the immense pressure of his own artificial legacy. For over 3 decades, Will Smith had meticulously crafted and worn the impenetrable mask of the ultimate Hollywood good guy, the universally beloved Fresh Prince who seemingly never made a misstep. This flawless, squeaky clean image was the very foundation of his billion-dollar empire, a carefully negotiated contract with the public that demanded absolute, unwavering perfection. But the unbearable psychological weight of maintaining that pristine, fake facade for 30 years inevitably creates deep, unseen internal fissures. According to Chappelle's profound analysis, the Oscars stage was simply the tragic arena where that immense, repressed pressure finally caused the mask to violently shatter into a million irreparable pieces. In the agonizing 10 minutes right before he was slated to receive the most prestigious award of his entire career, the polished corporate movie star completely vanished. He was abruptly replaced by a raw, untamed version of a man acting like a common thug, engaging in a street brawl back in his hometown of West Philly. Chappelle delivered a haunting verdict that permanently reframed the entire scandal, stating that Will Smith finally ripped off that perfect mask and showed the world he was just as ugly and flawed as the rest of us. It was a chilling diagnosis that stripped away all the glamorous Hollywood spin, leaving nothing but a tragic portrait of a man destroyed by the sheer exhaustion of performing his own life. Realizing his entire brand was rapidly going up in flames, Will frantically scrambled to put the broken pieces of that mask back together with a carefully crafted public apology. But his victims were absolutely not about to play along with the studio's desperate damage control. 4 months after the devastating incident, Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle embarked on an unprecedented, highly anticipated joint comedy tour across the continent of Europe. These massive sold-out arenas essentially transformed into a traveling international courtroom where the two titans of comedy served as both the fierce judges and the ruthless executioners. It was here, thousands of miles away from the sycophants in Los Angeles, that Chris Rock finally broke his silence and publicly addressed Will Smith's desperate attempt at a digital apology. A few weeks prior, Will had released a highly produced, heavily lit YouTube video expressing supposed remorse, answering curated questions, and begging for a peaceful reconciliation. Chris did not just reject this olive branch, he completely obliterated it, ruthlessly mocking the clip and labeling it a pathetic, heavily scripted hostage video. He exposed the apology for exactly what it was, a calculated public relations maneuver designed entirely to launder Will's image and salvage lucrative movie contracts, rather than a genuine expression of sorrow. From that European stage, Chris Rock zeroed in on the absolute most cowardly aspect of the entire assault, exposing the glaring physical mismatch between the two men. He reminded the roaring crowd that Will Smith was a massive athletic action star who had literally undergone months of brutal, intensive training to portray the legendary heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. Chris, on the other hand, was just a skinny, aging comedian whose only weapon was a microphone and a quick wit. Will Smith knew exactly what he was doing when he walked onto that stage, deliberately choosing a safe, much smaller target who was guaranteed not to fight back and ruin his impending Oscar victory. Chris had successfully dismantled Will's hollow apology and publicly exposed his cowardice, but he was saving his most lethal, devastating weapon for the one-year anniversary. He was holding on to a dark, unspoken secret that would humiliate the former superstar beyond repair. In March 2023, exactly 1 year after the violent incident, Chris Rock finally stepped into the absolute epicenter of the cultural conversation. Netflix had heavily promoted his live, global comedy special, Selective Outrage, building a level of astronomical anticipation that rivaled a heavyweight championship fight. The entire world waited with bated breath to see if the comedian would finally unleash his full wrath upon the man who assaulted him. Chris stepped onto the stage dressed in pure white, exuding an eerie, unsettling calm, and proceeded to execute a flawless masterclass in delayed vengeance. Chris did not just stand at the microphone and tell cheap jokes. He surgically dissected the assault and weaponized Will Smith's own artistic achievements against him. He told the roaring crowd that his ear was still actively ringing with the catchy melody of Summertime, Will's most iconic and beloved musical hit. By twisting that nostalgic, feel-good anthem into a dark punchline about his own physical suffering, Chris brilliantly forced the audience to forever associate Will's greatest artistic triumph with his darkest, most shameful moment. But the true, devastating kill shot came when Chris finally invoked the one highly taboo word that had been quietly haunting the Smith family for years. He looked dead into the television camera lens and dropped the massive entanglement bomb right onto the stage. He boldly dragged the infamous Red Table Talk episode back into the unforgiving cultural spotlight, reminding the entire world of the agonizing public humiliation Will endured when his wife casually detailed her affair with a much younger singer. Chris laid out the brutal, undeniable truth that absolutely nobody else in the Hollywood elite had the courage to voice out loud. He stated unequivocally that Jada's public infidelity and the ensuing internet mockery damaged Will's soul 1,000 times more than a mild joke about a haircut ever could. The entire globe had spent months calling Will Smith a cuckold, laughing at his tears, and ruthlessly stripping him of his masculinity on every single social media platform. Yet, Will did not dare raise his hands against his wife's lover, nor could he physically fight the millions of anonymous internet trolls tormenting his daily existence. Instead, he bottled up that suffocating, toxic rage and violently unloaded it onto Chris Rock, simply because Chris was the only safe, accessible target in the room. Chris branded the assault with the exact label it deserved, looking at the millions watching at home and calling it nothing more than pathetic, weak behavior. In just 1 hour of live, unedited television, Chris Rock completely stripped away Will Smith's manhood, his manufactured dignity, and his carefully constructed public narrative. And in doing so, he proved one undeniable, immortal truth about the unmatched power of a true artist facing down a bully. Today, the radioactive fallout from those 2 reckless seconds continues to permanently cripple what was once the most bulletproof career in Hollywood history. Will Smith is officially banished from the Academy Awards for an entire decade. His most lucrative film projects were quietly shelved by terrified studios, and the pristine, perfect 30-year image he painstakingly built is now completely buried. He foolishly believed that a single, violent slap would put a swift end to a joke, but instead, he accidentally triggered a brutal, lifelong sentence of inescapable public humiliation. Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle proved the ultimate, unwritten rule of the comedy ecosystem that Will Smith tragically forgot. You might be able to strike an artist with your fists, but they will simply absorb that physical pain, carry it back to the stage, and forge it into an immortal piece of art. The physical slap itself was over in a mere 2 seconds, but the masterful, devastating comedy it ultimately inspired will outlive them all, forever echoing in the archives of pop culture history. Between Chris Rock's surgical, venomous takedown and Dave Chappelle's deep philosophical empathy, whose response do you genuinely think was more powerful? If you were standing in Chris's shoes on that stage, would you ever find it in your heart to forgive Will Smith? Drop your raw thoughts and deepest theories in the comments section below. If this deep dive kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so you never miss out on exposing Hollywood's darkest, most heavily guarded secrets.